Edit the champagne flute stopped inches from Ethan's hand as Brandon's question silenced the entire banquet table. Is failure the only thing you're good at? Brandon asked, smiling beneath the white pendant lights as though he had delivered a harmless joke. The words carried across the private dining room of Bellamy's Steakhouse, clear above the low jazz from hidden speakers and the soft clatter of silverware against porcelain. Heat rose from cast-iron plates, filling the air with the scent of seared ribeye, garlic butter, and charred rosemary. Ethan kept his hand suspended for one measured second before withdrawing it to his lap. Across from him, Brandon leaned back in a tailored navy suit, one arm resting over the leather chair as their father's former business partners watched with uncertain smiles. He had chosen the seat at the head of the table, even though the dinner was supposed to celebrate their mother's 65th birthday. Ethan sat near the service door, where cold air slipped through each time a server entered carrying another polished tray. Brandon, their mother murmured, touching the pearl necklace at her throat. Her fork trembled lightly above the untouched salmon on her plate. Not tonight. What? Brandon spread his hands. The gold face of his watch flashed beneath the lights. We're family. We should be honest with each other. A few guests lowered their eyes. Someone cleared his throat beside the window. Beyond the glass, downtown Chicago glowed in neat rows of red taillights and illuminated office towers. But inside the room, every gaze had settled on Ethan. He wore a charcoal jacket that had been altered twice and a white shirt with one cuff beginning to fray. A faint smell of machine oil still clung to his hands despite the lemon soap he had used in the restaurant restroom. Brandon noticed it. Of course he did. You left engineering school, he continued. Your repair shop closed. That delivery job lasted, 6 months? He lifted his wine glass and turned toward the others. Now he's working nights in a warehouse and telling everyone he's building something. A quiet laugh escaped from the far end of the table, then died. Immediately, Ethan looked at Brandon, not the guests. Brandon had always spoken louder when he sensed an audience. His smile widened whenever Ethan remained silent, as if restraint were another weakness he could claim as evidence. You forgot the landscaping company, Ethan said. His voice was level. The room seemed to lean closer. Brandon laughed. Right. 3 spectacular failures before 40. He raised the glass toward his brother. Consistency deserves recognition. The rim touched his teeth with a soft click. Ethan's mother set down her fork. Ethan came because I asked him to. And I'm glad he did, Brandon replied. Maybe hearing the truth will finally help him. He reached beneath the table and placed a glossy folder beside Ethan's bread plate. The cover bore the silver logo of Carter Development Group, Brandon's real estate company. I can get you an interview with our maintenance department. Entry level. Stable hours. Benefits after 90 days. The folder slid over the white tablecloth, stopping beside a smear of melted butter. Brandon's offer looked generous from a distance. Up close, the position title had been underlined in blue ink. Facilities assistant. Ethan ran his thumb once along the folder's sharp edge. He remembered Brandon dismissing his request for a small business loan 3 years earlier without reading the proposal. He remembered the same blue pen tapping against the desk, while Brandon explained that some people were built to lead and others needed to accept instructions. But Ethan did not pull those memories into the room. He pushed the folder back across the table. No, the jazz shifted to a slower song. Ice cracked inside a water glass near the window. Brandon's eyebrows lifted. No, I already have work. Loading boxes at midnight isn't a career. It pays for what I need. Barely. Brandon's smile thinned. Mom told me your landlord gave you another notice. Their mother turned sharply. I told you that privately. He deserves to understand how serious this is. Brandon leaned forward, lowering his voice without lowering its reach. You're almost 40, Ethan. At some point, ambition without results becomes delusion. Ethan looked down at his hands. A shallow cut crossed one knuckle, sealed with clear adhesive from the workshop he rented behind an auto parts store on the south side. Beneath the table, his phone vibrated once against his thigh. He did not check it. He already knew what the message would say. The prototype had either passed the pressure test or failed again. For 11 months, he had spent every spare dollar and every hour after his warehouse shift developing a compact emergency water filtration unit designed for apartment buildings during municipal outages. Brandon knew only that Ethan was tinkering. Ethan had allowed him to believe it. Say something, Brandon prompted. The room had grown warm from the food and crowded bodies, yet Ethan could feel the cold draft brushing his ankle whenever the service door opened. A waiter paused behind him with a tray of desserts, waiting for the exchange to end. Ethan lifted his eyes. Brandon's expression held the relaxed certainty of a man who believed the verdict had already been delivered. "Keep watching," Ethan said. No anger sharpened the words. He spoke them quietly, which forced Brandon to stop smiling in order to hear. Then Ethan rose, buttoned his jacket, and bent to kiss his mother's cheek. Her skin carried the faint floral scent of the powder she had worn since he was a child. "I'll call you tomorrow," he told her. Brandon stared up at him. "You're leaving because you can't handle a question?" Ethan placed enough cash beside his plate to cover his meal. "I answered it." He walked toward the door while the first dessert spoons touched china behind him. In the hallway, the restaurant noise softened beneath thick carpet and dark wood paneling. His phone vibrated again. This time he stopped beneath a brass wall sconce and opened the message. The screen cast a pale glow across his face. "Pressure test passed. City review moved to Friday. Bring final unit." Ethan read it twice, slipped the phone into his pocket, and stepped into the elevator. As the mirrored doors began to close, Brandon appeared at the end of the hallway, still holding his wine glass. Ethan met his reflection between them, pressed the button for the lobby, and let the doors seal shut. The elevator doors opened onto the underground parking garage with a low mechanical hum, and Ethan stepped into the sharp smell of concrete, motor oil, and damp asphalt. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, throwing pale reflections across the polished hood of his 12-year-old pickup truck. He unlocked the driver's door with a key worn smooth from years of use, tossed his jacket onto the passenger seat, and rested both hands on the steering wheel without starting the engine. His phone still displayed the same message. "Pressure test passed. City review moved to Friday. Bring final unit." The glow from the screen faded, leaving only his reflection in the windshield and the distant echo of another car climbing the exit ramp. 5 minutes later, the pickup rolled through the sleeping business district toward the south side. Office towers gave way to brick warehouses, fenced loading yards, and aging machine shops where sodium lights painted everything in amber. Ethan parked behind a narrow corrugated steel building with faded blue lettering that read Carter Industrial Fabrication. The company had gone out of business years before, but the retired owner rented one corner of the workshop to independent builders who could not afford commercial laboratories. Inside, warm air carried the scent of cut aluminum, welding dust, and fresh lubricant. A drill press stood silent beside shelves crowded with clamps, copper fittings, and labeled storage bins. Ethan crossed directly to a stainless workbench where a compact metal cylinder rested beneath a folded shop towel. He lifted the cloth carefully. The prototype looked ordinary at first glance, about the size of a coffee thermos, with brushed aluminum housing and neatly machined fittings. 11 months of failures had been filed away inside that modest shell. A digital caliper lay beside it. Ethan measured the connector threads one final time before tightening them with a torque wrench. The click echoed through the empty building. Every movement followed the same routine he had repeated dozens of nights after finishing his warehouse shift. No speeches, no shortcuts, just work. He carried the unit to a steel testing frame bolted into the concrete floor and connected transparent pressure hoses. Water rushed through the chamber with a low hiss while gauges climbed steadily. 20 pounds. 40. 60. The metal casing remained perfectly still. Ethan watched a single droplet slide along one fitting before stopping. It was only condensation. He wiped it away with the sleeve of his work shirt and allowed the system to finish its cycle. Green indicator lights blinked one after another. Stable. A slow breath escaped him. Across the room, an old radio crackled into life on an automatic timer, filling the workshop with a classic rock station that faded in and out between bursts of static. Ethan disconnected the prototype, wrapped it in foam padding, and placed it inside a reinforced carrying case. He closed the latches with 2 clean metallic snaps. On the opposite wall hung photographs from his earlier attempts. Bent tubing, cracked housings, split seals. Every failure had been numbered and dated instead of thrown away. He paused before them for only a moment, then switched off the workshop lights one row at a time. Outside, dawn had begun pushing pale blue light above the rooftops. His warehouse shift started in 40 minutes. The loading dock smelled of cardboard, diesel exhaust, and freshly brewed coffee drifting from the break room. Forklifts beeped as they reversed between stacked pallets wrapped in clear plastic. Ethan slipped on reflective gloves, scanned incoming freight, and moved through the aisles with practiced efficiency. No one here knew about the prototype inside his truck. To them, he was simply the quiet night supervisor who volunteered for overtime whenever someone called in sick. During lunch, he sat alone on an overturned shipping crate behind the building. Cold air carried the scent of rain-soaked pavement while freight trains rumbled somewhere beyond the warehouses. His phone buzzed. His mother. Ethan answered immediately. "You left before dessert," she said. He smiled faintly, staring at the paper cup warming his hands. "I figured Brandon needed a bigger audience than I could give him." She sighed softly. "He shouldn't have spoken to you that way. He believes what he said." "Do you?" Ethan watched a flock of pigeons scatter as a truck pulled into the yard. "Not anymore." There was a pause long enough for another train horn to drift across the industrial district. "He called this morning," she admitted. "He thinks you'll eventually accept that job offer." Ethan crushed the empty coffee cup gently between both hands. The thin paper folded without resistance. "Tell him not to wait." He ended the call before she could ask another question. By late afternoon, Brandon stood inside the glass conference room overlooking the headquarters of Carter Development Group. The polished walnut table reflected rows of architectural drawings, while the city skyline stretched beyond floor-to-ceiling windows. Brandon flipped through quarterly reports, but his attention kept drifting back to the family dinner. Ethan's calm reply bothered him more than an angry argument would have. His executive assistant entered carrying a tablet. "The city's Innovation Review Committee finalized Friday's agenda," she said. Brandon barely looked up. "Anything important?" "Mostly infrastructure proposals. One emergency water systems presentation from an independent applicant." Brandon signed another document without reading the agenda. Those small inventors always think they're changing the world. He slid the folder aside. "Schedule golf for Friday afternoon instead." His assistant hesitated. "That presentation is receiving unusual attention from the review board." Brandon waved dismissively. If it mattered, one of the big engineering firms would already own it. She quietly closed the tablet and left the room. Brandon never noticed the applicant's name listed 3 lines below the project title. At the same moment, across the city, Ethan placed the reinforced case containing his finished prototype into the passenger seat of his pickup, fastened the seat belt around it, as though protecting a fragile passenger, started the engine, and drove toward the Municipal Engineering Center where Friday's review would decide far more than either brother yet understood. Edit Friday arrived with the muted buzz of fluorescent lights reflecting across polished stone floors as Ethan stepped through the revolving doors of the Chicago Municipal Engineering Center, carrying the reinforced case in his right hand. The lobby smelled faintly of fresh coffee, printer toner, and floor polish. Security scanners emitted short electronic chirps while visitors adjusted badges clipped to their jackets. Ethan placed the aluminum case onto the conveyor belt with careful hands, watching it disappear beneath the black rubber curtain before emerging untouched on the other side. He collected it, thanked the guard with a quiet nod, and followed blue signs toward Conference Hall B. The hallway walls displayed framed photographs of bridges, water treatment facilities, and emergency infrastructure projects built across Illinois over the past 30 years. Engineers in dark suits exchanged technical diagrams, while city officials spoke in low voices over paper cups of coffee. Ethan remained near the window overlooking the river, reviewing one final checklist inside the case. Foam inserts held every component exactly where he had packed them the night before. Spare seals, pressure gauges, technical drawings, test certifications. He closed the lid with 2 precise clicks. Across town, Brandon stood on the first tee of Lakeshore Country Club beneath a bright autumn sky. Crisp-cut grass released a fresh, earthy scent each time a golf cart rolled across the fairway. His clients laughed around him, balancing coffee cups on polished dashboards while discussing commercial developments scheduled for the following year. Brandon adjusted his glove, lined up the first drive, and sent the ball sailing into the morning air. Applause followed. His phone vibrated inside the cart's storage compartment. He ignored it. Another executive leaned over. "Wasn't there some city innovation event today?" Brandon shrugged while selecting another club. Probably another group of inventors hoping someone notices. The conversation drifted back to property values and investment forecasts. Nearly an hour later, inside Conference Hall B, Ethan stood before a semicircle of review board members seated behind long walnut tables. A large projection screen glowed softly against the front wall. White LED panels illuminated the room evenly, revealing every brushed metal surface of the compact filtration unit resting on the demonstration platform. The chairwoman adjusted her glasses. "Mr. Carter, you have 20 minutes. Ethan connected the inlet hose, secured the locking collar, and switched on the monitoring display. A low electric hum filled the room. Water began flowing through the transparent test lines while pressure readings climbed steadily across the digital panel. No dramatic gestures. No rehearsed performance. He explained material selection, emergency deployment time, maintenance intervals, and manufacturing costs in the same calm voice he had used during hundreds of solitary nights inside the workshop. Every answer came directly from months of testing rather than polished sales language. One engineer requested a simulated valve failure. Ethan reached forward, closed a release mechanism, and allowed pressure to spike. The gauge climbed rapidly before stabilizing exactly where his calculations predicted. A quiet murmur spread across the panel. Another reviewer asked whether the unit could operate during complete electrical outages. Ethan disconnected the external power supply without interrupting water flow. Battery backup indicators illuminated instantly. Green lights replaced amber. The room grew noticeably quieter. At the country club, Brandon checked his phone while waiting beside the ninth green. Several missed notifications crowded the screen. One subject line caught his attention. City Innovation Review Update. He opened it casually, expecting another invitation he intended to decline. Instead, the summary listed finalists invited to afternoon contract negotiations. His thumb stopped moving. The applicant's name appeared in bold letters. Ethan Carter. Brandon frowned, reading it again before looking toward the fairway where his business partners continued discussing vacation homes. "Everything okay?" one of them called. Brandon slipped the phone into his pocket. "Just work." His confident smile returned, though it settled less naturally than before. Back inside the engineering center, the final demonstration concluded with a controlled shutdown. Ethan wiped a few drops of water from the stainless platform using a folded microfiber cloth before stepping back. The chairwoman exchanged brief remarks with the other reviewers. Pens scratched quietly across evaluation forms. A projector fan continued spinning overhead, sending warm air across the room. After several minutes, she stood. "Mr. Carter, thank you. Please wait outside while the committee completes its discussion." Ethan gathered his papers without asking how he had performed. He carried the aluminum case into the hallway and sat alone on a wooden bench overlooking the river. Sunlight reflected from the water onto the ceiling in slow, shifting patterns. Somewhere down the corridor, a vending machine released a bottle with a hollow thud. 23 minutes passed. Then the conference room doors opened. The chairwoman stepped into the hallway carrying a blue folder embossed with the city seal. She extended her hand before speaking. "Congratulations, Mr. Carter. The committee has voted unanimously to advance your filtration system into the city's emergency infrastructure pilot program." Ethan accepted the handshake, nodded once, and signed the acknowledgement papers resting on a clipboard. There was no celebration, no raised voice, no triumphant speech. Only the steady scratch of his pen across official documents and the firm click of the folder closing after the final signature. As he left the building carrying the same aluminum case that Brandon had dismissed as another hobby, his phone vibrated with an incoming call. The screen displayed one familiar name. Brandon. Ethan watched it ring until the final tone faded, slipped the phone back into his pocket unanswered, and walked toward the parking garage while, several miles away, Brandon canceled the rest of his golf game and drove straight toward the engineering center, determined to see with his own eyes what his younger brother had just accomplished. Brandon reached the engineering center just as the glass entrance doors closed behind a stream of departing officials, their conversations fading into the echo of polished marble and humming ventilation. The lobby smelled of fresh paper, coffee, and rain carried in on expensive leather shoes. He adjusted his suit jacket, still crisp from the country club, and strode toward the reception desk with the same confident pace that had opened countless boardroom doors. "I'm looking for the Innovation Review Committee," he said, setting his phone on the counter. The receptionist glanced at her monitor before offering a courteous smile. "The morning session has concluded, sir. I'm here to meet one of the applicants." "Name?" "Ethan Carter." Her fingers tapped softly across the keyboard. "Mr. Carter has already completed his presentation and departed after signing the pilot program documents." Brandon remained silent for a moment. Behind him, the elevator chimed and opened, releasing several engineers carrying rolled blueprints. One of them laughed while saying that compact filtration system could save cities millions during emergency outages. Another nodded. Best demonstration of the morning. Neither man noticed Brandon standing only a few feet away. He picked up his phone without another word and walked outside. Cool air swept across the plaza, carrying the scent of wet concrete and roasted coffee from a nearby cafe. His reflection stared back from the tinted glass doors as traffic rolled steadily along the avenue. For the first time since the family dinner, certainty gave way to calculation. Instead of driving back to the office, Brandon climbed into his SUV and headed downtown. Carter Development Group occupied 3 floors of a modern tower overlooking the Chicago River. Inside the executive conference room, sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows onto architectural models displayed beneath acrylic covers. Brandon entered briskly, tossed his car keys onto the walnut table, and called his operations director inside. "Pull everything you can find on the city's emergency infrastructure pilot." The director frowned. "Is something wrong?" "Just do it." Within 20 minutes, reports covered the conference table. Brandon skimmed them quickly. The program was larger than he had imagined. Municipal contracts, state partnerships, manufacturing opportunities, long-term licensing. His fingers slowed when he reached projected financial estimates attached to successful pilot projects. The numbers were far beyond anything he had associated with Ethan's workshop. He leaned back in his chair. Leather creaked softly beneath him. Who else made the finalist list? Mostly established engineering firms. And Ethan? Independent applicant. Brandon stared through the glass wall into the busy office beyond. Employees crossed between workstations carrying tablets, coffee cups, and contract folders. None of them knew that the younger brother Brandon had mocked only 2 nights earlier now occupied the same professional conversation as billion-dollar manufacturers. He reached for his phone and called Ethan again. Straight to voicemail. He called once more. The same result. His thumb hovered over the screen before typing a short message. "Congratulations. We should talk." He read it twice, then erased every word. Instead, he slipped the phone into his pocket. Across the city, Ethan stood inside the small fabrication workshop tightening the final screws on a second prototype. Afternoon sunlight entered through dusty skylights, painting bright rectangles across the concrete floor where scattered metal shavings reflected tiny flashes of silver. A portable fan pushed warm air carrying the smell of machine oil and aluminum dust around the room. The reinforced case from the City Review rested unopened beside the workbench. Ethan had not celebrated. He had returned to work. His phone vibrated twice. Brandon's missed calls appeared on the screen. Ethan pressed the side button, darkening the display, and reached instead for a precision screwdriver. He adjusted a valve assembly by less than a quarter turn before checking the pressure gauge once more. The workshop door slid open. The retired owner, Frank Donovan, stepped inside carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. Steam curled into the cool air between them. "Heard the news," Frank said, placing 1 cup on the bench. "Looks like they finally saw what you've been building." Ethan accepted the coffee with a quiet nod. The cup warmed his grease-marked hands. "It's only the beginning." Frank looked toward the reinforced case. "You going to frame that approval letter?" Ethan smiled faintly. "No, I need both hands free." Frank chuckled softly before heading back outside, the screen door snapping shut behind him. Ethan finished tightening the final connector, wiped the housing clean with a lint-free cloth, and arranged his tools in perfect order before switching off the workbench lamp. Every action remained measured, almost ordinary. Meanwhile, Brandon sat alone in his office as twilight settled over the skyline. The city lights reflected across the conference table where Ethan's name remained highlighted inside the printed report. Brandon slowly picked up the folder, folded it closed, and looked toward the framed photograph of the 2 brothers taken years earlier after their father's retirement ceremony. Ethan had been smiling then, holding a small notebook instead of a briefcase. Brandon reached for the frame, hesitated, and set it back exactly where it had been. His office phone rang. The caller ID displayed the name of one of Chicago's largest commercial developers. Brandon answered immediately. "We've just heard about the city's new pilot program," the voice said. "Whoever designed that filtration system could become a valuable partner. Any chance your company knows the inventor?" Brandon's eyes settled on the darkened phone screen lying beside the report. After a long pause, he answered quietly, "Yes. He's my younger brother." Edit Monday morning filled the lobby of Carter Development Group with the muted rhythm of polished shoes crossing marble floors, elevator chimes, and the rich aroma of freshly brewed espresso drifting from the reception lounge. Brandon stepped through the revolving doors carrying a leather portfolio beneath one arm. But conversations that usually paused to greet him now continued with quick glances toward nearby television screens. A business news channel played silently above the reception desk, while closed captions rolled beneath footage of engineers demonstrating emergency infrastructure technologies. Ethan's filtration unit appeared for only a few seconds, its brushed aluminum surface gleaming. Beneath studio lights before the segment shifted to city officials discussing resilient water systems. Brandon slowed his pace. The receptionist noticed him watching. "Congratulations," she said automatically. "Your family must be proud." Brandon forced a brief smile that disappeared before he reached the elevators. Inside the executive floor conference room, sunlight reflected across glass walls where project schedules and financial forecasts had always dominated discussion. Today, however, one of the senior partners placed a newspaper beside Brandon's chair before the meeting even began. The business section featured a photograph of the Innovation Review Committee standing beside several finalists. Ethan appeared near the center of the image wearing the same charcoal jacket from the presentation, one hand resting on the reinforced aluminum case. The headline mentioned breakthrough emergency water technology selected for the city's pilot program. No dramatic language, just facts. Brandon folded the newspaper without commenting. "Interesting connection," one board member remarked while adjusting his reading glasses. "Didn't know your younger brother was an engineer." Brandon answered evenly. "He isn't with our company." "Maybe he should be," another executive replied. "Municipal infrastructure is becoming one of the fastest-growing sectors in the Midwest." Several heads nodded around the table. Brandon opened his laptop, but the quarterly development proposal on the screen blurred behind reflections from the conference room lights. He closed it again. Across the city, Ethan backed his pickup toward a loading dock at the warehouse just before sunrise. Diesel engines idled nearby, while forklifts carried stacked pallets beneath bright warehouse lamps. Cold air smelled of cardboard, fresh pine shipping crates, and wet concrete. Ethan pulled on reflective gloves, scanned freight labels, and joined the morning crew exactly as he had every workday. News about the city program had already reached the supervisors. "Saw you on television," one coworker called while securing shrink wrap around a pallet. Ethan smiled politely and lifted another crate onto the conveyor. "Still have today's shift." The supervisor walked over carrying a clipboard. "You know you don't have to be here." Ethan tightened a shipping strap until it locked with a sharp metallic click. "Until someone signs a contract. I work where I promised I'd work." The supervisor nodded once without another word. By mid-afternoon, the city engineering office contacted Ethan requesting additional performance data before final contract negotiations. He spread technical drawings across the workshop bench, checked revised calculations, and printed updated manufacturing estimates. The laser printer filled the room with the warm scent of fresh toner, while late sunlight filtered through dusty skylights, catching tiny metal particles suspended above the work table. Every page entered the binder in perfect order. No celebration interrupted the routine, only preparation. Meanwhile, Brandon sat inside his office reviewing emails that seemed unusually repetitive. 3 separate developers wanted introductions to Ethan. 2 investment firms requested meetings concerning the pilot program. 1 infrastructure supplier asked whether Carter Development Group intended to partner with the inventor. Brandon answered none of them. Instead, he walked to the window overlooking the Chicago River where tugboats pushed loaded barges beneath steel bridges. His phone vibrated again. This time it was their mother. He accepted the call. "Did you see the news?" she asked. The sound of dishes being stacked echoed softly behind her voice. Brandon rested one hand against the cool glass. Everyone seems to have. Have you spoken to your brother? Not yet. She paused briefly. Maybe you should congratulate him. Brandon looked toward the framed skyline beyond the river. Eventually. Don't wait too long. The line went quiet. After ending the call, Brandon opened the bottom drawer of his desk and removed the blue folder he had offered Ethan during the birthday dinner. The entry-level maintenance job description still rested inside exactly where Ethan had pushed it back across the table. Brandon read the salary, benefits, and reporting structure before closing the folder again. The paper suddenly felt smaller than he remembered. That evening, Ethan arrived at the workshop after finishing another warehouse shift. The room welcomed him with familiar smells of aluminum shavings, machine oil, and warm electrical motors. He placed the updated engineering binder beside the reinforced case and began assembling a third prototype using improved valve tolerances suggested during the city review. A digital clock on the wall ticked steadily toward 9. Outside, headlights swept briefly across the frosted windows before disappearing. Then another pair of headlights stopped. A car door closed. Slow footsteps crossed the gravel lot. Ethan continued tightening a connector without looking toward the entrance. A firm knock echoed against the metal door, followed by a second one, louder than the first. Ethan set the wrench down carefully, wiped both hands with a clean shop cloth, walked across the concrete floor, unlocked the deadbolt, and pulled the door open. Brandon stood beneath the workshop light, still wearing the same tailored suit from the office, holding nothing except the folded blue employment folder that Ethan had refused only days earlier. Edit Brandon stood beneath the workshop light, while cold air pushed through the open doorway, carrying the smell of wet gravel and exhaust from the idling SUV behind him. The blue employment folder hung from his right hand, its glossy cover catching a thin strip of fluorescent light. Ethan looked at it, then at his brother's polished shoes sinking slightly into the damp ground. You drove across the city to return paperwork? Ethan asked. Brandon glanced past him toward the workbench, where the third prototype rested beneath a white inspection lamp. Metal shavings glittered across the concrete floor, and a cooling fan hummed beside the pressure frame. Can I come in? Ethan stepped aside without answering. Brandon entered carefully, avoiding a coil of transparent tubing near the door. The warmth inside fogged the edges of his glasses for a moment. He removed them, wiped the lenses with a folded handkerchief, and studied the shelves lined with numbered failures, cracked housings, warped seals, bent connectors. Each part carried a date written in black marker. You kept all of these? He asked. Ethan closed the door and turned the deadbolt. They tell me what not to repeat. Brandon placed the folder on the workbench beside the city binder. The paper looked out of place among torque wrenches, calipers, and grease-marked diagrams. I heard about the pilot contract. So did half your office. People are asking me for introductions. Ethan fitted a pressure hose onto the third unit and tightened the collar until the wrench clicked. Then tell them you don't represent me. Brandon's jaw shifted. The radio near the drill press played softly through static, and somewhere inside the wall, an old steam pipe knocked twice. I'm not here to represent you, he said. I'm here because Carter Development can help. Ethan opened the inlet valve. Water moved through the clear line with a low hiss. Help with what? Manufacturing contacts. Legal review. Distribution. You built something valuable, but one city pilot doesn't make a company. Brandon opened the folder. The maintenance job description had been removed. In its place lay a typed partnership proposal bearing the Carter Development logo. He turned it toward Ethan. We create a new infrastructure division. You control the technology. I handle expansion. Ethan watched the pressure gauge climb past 40 pounds. What percentage? 35 for you. The green indicator light blinked once. Ethan reached across the bench and closed the folder. No, Brandon stared at him. You haven't read it. You just told me what matters. 35% of something national is worth more than 100% of a workshop behind an auto parts store. Ethan released the test pressure. Water rushed into the drainage tank, striking stainless steel with a hollow roar that filled the room. When the noise faded, he disconnected the unit and wiped the fittings with a clean cloth. 4 nights ago, you offered me an entry-level job with benefits after 90 days. 4 nights ago, I didn't know what you had. That is exactly the problem. Brandon's fingers pressed against the folder's edge, Business decisions are based on information. You had information. You knew I had worked for 11 months. You knew I asked you to read the original proposal 3 years ago. You decided the person presenting it made the work worthless. Brandon stepped closer. The sharp scent of his cologne mixed with machine oil and warm metal. That proposal failed. The company failed. The design changed. Then why didn't you tell me? Ethan set the cloth down and faced him fully. Because every conversation with you became a trial, and you had already written the verdict. Brandon looked toward the wall of discarded components. Under the white lights, the dates formed a long timeline of effort he had never bothered to see. His voice lowered. You could still lose the pilot. Yes. A manufacturer could copy the concept. The patent is pending. The city could delay funding. Then I keep working at the warehouse. Brandon gave a short, disbelieving laugh. That's your plan? Go back to loading boxes if this falls apart. No. My plan is to keep building whether people applaud or not. The fan rattled as it slowed, leaving the workshop unusually quiet. Brandon opened the proposal again, flipped to the ownership page, and pulled a pen from inside his jacket. Name your percentage. Ethan did not look at the paper. There is no percentage. Everyone has a number. You still think this is about proving I'm worth something to you, isn't it? Brandon asked. The question landed harder than his voice intended. Ethan lifted the finished prototype and placed it inside the reinforced case. Foam compressed around the aluminum housing. He secured both latches, then moved the city binder beside it. At dinner, you asked whether failure was the only thing I was good at. You didn't ask because you wanted an answer. You wanted witnesses. Brandon's hand remained around the pen. I was out of line. You were honest. And now I'm offering you a real opportunity. Ethan picked up the blue folder, walked to the steel trash bin near the drill press, and held it over the opening. Brandon crossed the floor quickly. Don't be dramatic. Ethan released it. The folder struck the empty metal bottom with a flat slap. That was the position you offered when you believed I had nothing, he said. This proposal is the position you offer now that other people believe I have something. Neither one tells me who I am. They only tell me who you are when the numbers change. Brandon's mouth opened, then closed. A car passed outside, sweeping white headlights across the frosted windows and briefly illuminating the framed city approval letter beside the workbench. Ethan removed his gloves and folded them neatly. Leave the workshop. Brandon looked down at the folder inside the bin. You're making a mistake. Ethan switched off the inspection lamp. Half the room fell into shadow, leaving only the green indicators glowing on the third prototype's test panel. Maybe, he said, but it will be mine. Brandon walked toward the door, his steps slow against the gritty concrete. Before Ethan opened it, Brandon stopped and looked back at the shelves of failed parts. What happens when the city asks whether you can deliver 500 units? Ethan unlocked the deadbolt. They already did. Brandon turned sharply. Ethan held the door open as cold air rushed between them. The deadline is Monday morning, he continued. And tomorrow, I'm meeting the manufacturer your company has been trying to win over for 2 years. For the first time, Brandon left without offering advice, while Ethan closed the door, returned to the workbench, and began preparing the production plan that would decide which brother the city trusted when the watching finally ended. Edit's Saturday morning began inside a manufacturing facility on the western edge of Chicago, where rows of precision milling machines filled the enormous building with a steady metallic rhythm. Bright white LED lights reflected across stainless steel work tables, while the sharp scent of coolant, fresh-cut aluminum, and warm electrical motors drifted through the production floor. Ethan walked beside 2 manufacturing engineers carrying the reinforced aluminum case under one arm and a binder of technical specifications under the other. Every few yards, robotic arms lifted machined components into inspection fixtures with smooth mechanical precision. The plant manager stopped beside an automated assembly line and folded his safety glasses into his shirt pocket. Your filtration unit is designed well, he said, tapping lightly on the engineering drawings. But we don't commit production space because of drawings. We commit because the inventor understands manufacturing. Ethan set the reinforced case onto a steel inspection bench. The latches snapped open with 2 clean clicks. He removed the prototype, connected it to the plant's testing manifold, and asked for one adjustment to the incoming pressure. Water surged through industrial-grade pipes with a deep rushing sound. Pressure climbed across digital monitors mounted overhead. Engineers gathered quietly behind him. Ethan explained every machining tolerance, every material specification, and every assembly sequence without opening the binder. When one engineer intentionally misaligned a valve housing by less than 1 millimeter, Ethan stopped him immediately. That seal fails after approximately 400 pressure cycles, he said, rotating the component with grease-marked fingers. The chamfer has to remain exactly here. He pointed to a narrow polished edge no wider than a pencil tip. The engineer smiled slightly before correcting the alignment. The plant manager watched the exchange without interrupting. Across town, Brandon entered the executive boardroom carrying a leather portfolio and yesterday's municipal infrastructure reports. Sunlight reflected from the Chicago River through the glass walls, scattering bright lines across the conference table. Two senior investors waited beside projection screens, displaying regional development opportunities. One investor adjusted his cufflinks. "We heard the city is moving quickly on emergency water infrastructure." Brandon nodded. "They are. Can your company participate?" Brandon hesitated almost imperceptibly. "Possibly. Do you have access to the inventor?" Brandon rested both palms against the walnut table. For years he had answered every business question without uncertainty. Today his eyes shifted briefly toward the skyline before returning to the investors. "Not the way I expected." Neither investor responded immediately. The silence lasted long enough for the ventilation system to become audible above the room. Meanwhile, back at the manufacturing plant, Ethan completed the final performance demonstration. Water pressure stabilized exactly where projected. Diagnostic indicators remained green throughout the entire cycle. One engineer disconnected the system, examined the internal components, and whistled softly beneath his breath. "No measurable wear," he said. The plant manager extended his hand. "We can manufacture 500 pilot units on schedule." Ethan accepted the handshake. Warm machine oil lingered faintly on both men's gloves. "We'll begin tooling Monday morning," the manager continued. "Assuming the city signs the production authorization." Ethan nodded once. "They will." Before leaving, he walked the length of the assembly floor again, asking practical questions about inspection procedures, packaging materials, and emergency production capacity. He never asked how much attention the project was receiving. He only asked how quickly the next unit could leave the line. Late that afternoon, Carter Development hosted a meeting with several municipal consultants concerning future infrastructure investments. Brandon presented redevelopment proposals beneath crisp digital slides while coffee steamed from porcelain cups around the table. Halfway through the discussion, one consultant interrupted politely. "Before we continue," she said, "our department asked whether you've coordinated with Ethan Carter's manufacturing timeline. His pilot program will influence several of these infrastructure decisions." Brandon lowered the presentation remote. The projector fan hummed quietly overhead. "Our companies are independent." "Of course," the consultant replied. "Still, his schedule affects the city's priorities." Several attendees made notes. Brandon resumed the presentation, but the room had shifted. For years he had been the person others referenced when discussing large-scale projects. Now another Carter carried that weight, and he was not sitting at the table. By early evening, Ethan returned to his workshop. Golden sunlight filtered through the dusty windows, casting long beams across organized tools and numbered prototype shelves. He removed his work boots, rolled a blueprint across the central bench, and began revising the assembly sequence according to recommendations from the manufacturing engineers. A sharpened pencil moved steadily across the paper. Measurements changed by fractions of an inch. Part numbers were updated. Efficiency improved line by line. His phone vibrated once, then again. Finally, he glanced at the screen. 3 missed calls from Brandon. 1 voicemail. Ethan slipped the phone into his pocket unopened and continued marking revisions. A few minutes later, the workshop door opened quietly without knocking. Their mother stood inside holding a small paper bakery box tied with blue ribbon. The sweet scent of cinnamon rolls drifted into the room, mixing unexpectedly with machine oil and warm steel. She looked around slowly at the shelves of failed prototypes before resting her eyes on the finished unit lying across the workbench. "I didn't understand," she said softly. Ethan removed his safety glasses and set them beside the blueprint. She walked closer, touching one of the numbered aluminum housings with gentle fingertips. You built all of this while everyone kept telling you to quit. Ethan smiled faintly, mostly while they weren't looking. She placed the bakery box beside the reinforced case. Your brother came by the house. Ethan waited. She folded both hands together. He asked me if I've always believed in you. The workshop grew quiet except for the ticking wall clock and the distant rumble of freight trains beyond the industrial district. Ethan closed the blueprint, slid it carefully into its storage tube, and looked toward the darkening windows before answering. What did you tell him? Their mother rested one hand on the warm bakery box while the sweet scent of cinnamon drifted gently through the workshop, softening the sharper smell of machine oil and polished aluminum. Late afternoon sunlight poured through the high windows, turning floating dust into ribbons of gold above the workbench. Ethan waited quietly, his safety glasses lying beside the rolled blueprint. She looked at the shelves, filled with numbered failures once more before answering. I told him I never believed you would stop. Her fingers traced the blue ribbon around the bakery box. There were times I didn't understand what you were building. There were times I worried, but I never believed you were finished. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly toward the reinforced case resting on the bench. The metal latches reflected a narrow strip of sunlight. That's enough, he said. She stepped closer and brushed a speck of aluminum dust from the sleeve of his work shirt, the same simple gesture she had made since he was a boy coming home covered in grass stains or sawdust. He asked another question, she continued quietly. He asked when you became stronger than him. Ethan gave a faint smile that disappeared almost immediately. He asked the wrong question. Before she could answer, the workshop phone mounted beside the office door rang sharply, its mechanical bell echoing against the concrete walls. Ethan crossed the room, lifted the receiver, and listened. His expression never changed. Yes, he replied. I'll be there in 30 minutes. He replaced the receiver carefully. The city wants the final production agreement signed tonight instead of Monday. Their mother picked up the bakery box. Then don't keep them waiting. She kissed his cheek before leaving, the screen door closing softly behind her. Half an hour later, Ethan entered the municipal engineering headquarters carrying the reinforced case beneath one arm. Evening lights glowed across the polished lobby while custodians quietly buffed marble floors, leaving behind the clean scent of wax and citrus cleaner. In a conference room overlooking the river, city officials, manufacturing representatives, and legal advisors sat around a long walnut table scattered with contract folders and stainless steel water pitchers. The production agreement rested in front of an empty chair reserved for Ethan. As he entered, conversations paused naturally. No one announced him. No one exaggerated his arrival. They simply waited until he reached the table. The chairwoman smiled. Ready? Ethan nodded once and opened the binder. Contract terms were reviewed line by line beneath warm recessed lighting. Manufacturing milestones, inspection procedures, delivery schedules, emergency testing protocols. Every page carried notes he had already prepared. He asked 3 technical questions, requested 1 clarification about inspection authority, and initialed each revision with calm precision. Across the city, Brandon sat alone inside his office after nearly every employee had gone home. The skyline beyond the glass walls shimmered with thousands of lights reflected across the river. His desk remained covered with unanswered emails from investors and developers asking about Ethan's project. Instead of replying, Brandon opened an old metal filing cabinet tucked into the corner of his office. Inside rested family photographs, retirement speeches, and faded company newsletters dating back to the years when their father still managed Carter Industrial Fabrication. Brandon slowly removed one yellowed photograph, showing 2 boys standing inside the original machine shop. Ethan, barely 12, held a small homemade water pump assembled from scrap pipe and brass fittings. Brandon remembered laughing at it then too. He sat down heavily, the leather chair sighing beneath him. The photograph remained in his hands for several minutes before he quietly whispered into the empty office. I never saw you. No one heard the words except the ventilation system humming overhead. Back at city headquarters, the final signature dried beneath Ethan's pen. The manufacturing representative slid the completed agreement into a blue portfolio embossed with the city seal. Cameras from the public affairs office waited near the doorway for a brief announcement. The chairwoman looked toward Ethan. The press would like a statement. Ethan adjusted the latches on the reinforced case instead. The product matters more than I do. She smiled knowingly. Even so, they'll ask. Minutes later, Ethan stood before several local reporters beneath bright studio lights. Camera shutters clicked softly. Microphones extended toward him across a narrow podium. One reporter asked the expected question. What would you say to people who believed your idea would never succeed? Ethan looked briefly at the compact filtration unit displayed beside him. Stainless steel reflected the camera lights like quiet stars. Then he answered without raising his voice. Results don't argue. They simply arrive. The room fell silent for a heartbeat before another wave of camera shutters filled the air. The interview ended almost immediately afterward. Ethan declined further questions, shook hands with the manufacturing team, and carried the reinforced case back toward the parking garage. At nearly the same moment, Brandon watched the live broadcast replay on the television mounted inside his office. No celebration, no revenge, no mention of the dinner or the insult. Just that single sentence. He lowered the remote slowly onto the conference table. Then, for the first time in years, he opened his email and began typing individual replies to every investor who had requested an introduction. Each response contained only one sentence. If you wish to work with Ethan Carter, you will need to contact him directly. He pressed send on every message without adding his company name or offering to negotiate. When the last email disappeared from the outbox, Brandon stood, picked up the old photograph of the two brothers, switched off the office lights, and walked out carrying nothing except the picture. While across the city, Ethan drove toward home, unaware that the first real apology from his brother had begun not with words, but with a choice. The first 500 filtration units rolled off the assembly line 3 weeks later beneath rows of white factory lights, each brushed aluminum housing catching a cold silver shine as inspectors checked seals, pressure ratings, and serial numbers. Conveyor belts hummed across the vast floor while pneumatic tools snapped in quick, precise bursts, and the air carried the mingled scent of cutting fluid, warm steel, and fresh cardboard from the shipping station. Ethan stood beside the final inspection table in a Navy work jacket with the city authorization badge clipped to his chest. He watched one unit complete its pressure cycle, then signed the release form with the same black pen he had used on every production document. No cameras followed him that morning. No reporters crowded the aisle. The result moved forward without needing applause. Outside the loading bay, city trucks waited beneath pale winter sunlight, their engines releasing white vapor into the cold. Workers secured the final pallets with heavy straps, and Ethan placed one gloved hand against the nearest crate before the doors closed. The project that had once existed only in a rented workshop now filled 3 trucks bound for public buildings across Chicago. His phone vibrated inside his jacket. Brandon had sent a message asking whether they could meet that evening at their mother's house. Ethan read it once and typed back, 7 o'clock. The answer contained neither warmth nor refusal. At exactly 7, the dining room looked almost the same as it had on the night of their mother's birthday. The same pearl-white plates rested on the table. The same brass chandelier cast amber light over the polished wood. But the air smelled of roast chicken, sage, and warm bread instead of seared steak and expensive wine, and no business partners occupied the chairs. Only their mother sat between her sons, her hands folded around a cup of tea. Brandon arrived without his tailored jacket. He wore a plain gray sweater and carried the old photograph from their father's machine shop inside a simple wooden frame. Ethan noticed the absence of a briefcase immediately. Brandon placed the photograph at the center of the table. In it, the two boys stood beneath fluorescent shop lights, Ethan holding his homemade water pump while Brandon leaned against a workbench with a grin that had once seemed harmless. "I found this in my office," Brandon said. The clock on the wall ticked steadily behind him. He ran one thumb along the frame's rough edge before looking directly at Ethan. "I remember that pump." Ethan unfolded his napkin and placed it across his lap. "You called it junk." Brandon nodded. "I did." Their mother lowered her eyes to her tea. Steam drifted past her cheek and disappeared beneath the chandelier. Brandon did not soften what came next. He admitted that he had spent years treating Ethan's setbacks as evidence of permanent weakness because it made his own success feel more secure. Each failed company, each temporary job, each unpaid bill had become another story Brandon repeated until the family began seeing Ethan through the same narrow frame. At the birthday dinner, he had not been trying to help. He had been performing. I wanted everyone at that table to agree with me, Brandon said. His fingers tightened around the wooden frame. And when you told me to keep watching, I thought you were bluffing. Ethan remained still. The room held the soft sounds of silverware shifting against china and the furnace breathing warm air through the vent. Then you watched, he said. Brandon exhaled slowly. Yes. He reached into his pocket and placed a folded document on the table. It was not a partnership offer. It was a formal letter to the board of Carter Development Group withdrawing the company from every attempt to leverage Ethan's name, project, or family connection in future negotiations. Beneath it lay copies of the emails Brandon had sent directing investors, suppliers, and consultants to contact Ethan independently. I should have done this before anyone asked, Brandon said. I should have respected the work before the contract made it valuable. Ethan read the first page carefully. The paper was smooth and cool beneath his fingertips. He set it beside the photograph. This does not erase the dinner. I know. It does not erase the years before it. I know that too. Brandon's voice remained low. I'm not asking you to forget. Their mother reached for the breadbasket, but Ethan stopped her gently with one raised hand. This part belonged to the brothers. What are you asking? He said. Brandon looked at the photograph again. A chance to stop being the man who needed you to fail. The sentence landed without drama. No music rose. No one moved. Outside, tires whispered along the wet street, and the porch light cast a pale rectangle across the front window. Ethan folded the withdrawal letter once along its original crease. You do not get a role in my company. Brandon nodded. Understood. You do not speak for me in business. Understood. And you never turn my mistakes into entertainment again. Brandon lifted his eyes. I won't. Ethan studied him for several seconds, not searching for sorrow but for discipline. Then he slid the old photograph back across the table. Keep it, he said, but frame the whole story this time. Their mother finally released the breath she had been holding and passed the bread between them. Dinner resumed slowly. Brandon asked no questions about revenue, ownership, or expansion. Instead, he listened while Ethan explained how the first units would be installed in schools, senior housing complexes, and emergency shelters. He listened when Ethan described the workers being hired for the next production run. He listened when their mother recalled how, at 12, Ethan had flooded half the garage testing that first pump. Brandon laughed once, but this time the sound carried no blade. Months later, Ethan stood inside the same workshop where his wall of failed parts remained exactly as it had been. A new sign hung above the entrance, Carter Resilient Systems. He had kept the warehouse job until the first municipal payment cleared, then resigned only after training his replacement. The numbered failures still lined the shelves, not as trophies of humiliation, but as instructions written in metal. One evening, Brandon arrived carrying 2 cups of coffee and stopped at the doorway instead of walking in uninvited. Ethan looked up from the workbench. Brandon raised 1 cup. Permission? Ethan nodded toward the empty stool beside him. No speeches followed. No easy restoration returned them to childhood. Brandon sat beneath the white shop light while Ethan tightened a valve on the newest model, and for once he watched without judgment, interruption, or advice. Years earlier, Brandon had mistaken failure for Ethan's identity. In the end, failure became the one thing that taught Brandon how to finally see his brother.